Hi, this is Mark. In this video, I'm going to talk about some misconceptions regarding disorders or illnesses in general. There is a strong link between the medical insurance companies and the quantity or the recent expansion in terms of the quantity of illnesses or disorders that have arrived in the past few decades. And of course, there's there has to be like in a or society there's some constraint regarding behavior and managing certain conditions and trying to reach what we suppose is a normality, which doesn't really exist. Absolutely, it's just a relative standard that we in place to kind of judge where work positions of these disorders relative to it. Because when you consider something like, for instance, ADHD, it has been increased in prominence in the past few decades, skyrocketed recently since the technological age. Well, of course, there's also, uh, there in a lot of these traits or these symptoms are loosely defined, and it's very easy to get diagnosed because if you may want to get Vyvanse to get through academics or Adderall to help you succeed in life, or it's very easy to get through the system, find loopholes, and of course there's going to be more loopholes to be found nowadays because the intersection, or there's more ways or possibilities to, when you add complexity to a system, to find loopholes unless it's mitigated. So basically, there's always going to be refinement of a system, but in the initial phase, a lot of times there's trial and error, and you're trying things out, or you create something new. It's easy to find those loopholes, and this, in academics, there's more ways to cheat than ever before because of Google and just the access. We have the access to cheat or find a way around the system to succeed with less and less time. So in terms of like ADHD, there's all these distractions due to technology, um, and this disorder is really what it boils down to is it's a problem with the possibly the receptivity of the receptors, the reward signaling of dopamine and other various neurotransmitters. It gets way more complex in terms of the interaction between the neurotransmitters because dopamine, we could consider it excitatory, but it could act as it acts differently in different given scenarios or different combinations. So and really taking like Adderall or medication to kind of uh, it can be a problem too because you cause desensitization, especially if you take out large dose, and the reward signaling is desensitized, especially when you get off of it. You're going to notice that you're going to be in a lower level, and you have to kind of work your way back to the initial point, and it's basically anything. What goes up must come down. When you if you go like artificially create a, let's say, a mood state, or you amplify your current mood, well, there's with every action there's they say with every action there's equal opposite reaction. But yeah, of course, when you go up in some direction, you're not necessarily going to go down in the exact same, but it's the energy displacement. You're displacing energy in one direction. Your body tries to achieve equilibrium, which is essentially, you could define it as a midpoint. And as you go up artificially, you're actually you're shifting the conservation of energy. You're shifting the energy in some form such that you have to derive or recharge your whole unit. So essentially, the recharge point, and that's what causes like a depression or episode. Um, it's so when creating, like when you take arrow, happens a similar way. You had you could focus, you get this recharge, it helps you, it gives you energy, and then when you get off of it, depending on how much you've taken, it can cause a relapse, or you can actually, or uh, you you'll bounce, or you go towards the other direction if you stop immediately. That's why they say you should taper off anytime you take a medication. But in terms of ADHD, it's definitely overdiagnosed. Of course, also it's loosely defined. We don't really. It's very hard to find ways to test it now. Like, of course, we're gaining more technology, but I mean, there are scenarios or cases where there's like poor dopamine receptivity, so you're not getting the reward signaling that you should achieve. And the way I view it, uh, um, the way I view it is essentially think of like ADHD is like if you have like menial or tasks that are the normal population or the population of people or those who do not possess an alteration or like I would say a problem with the receptivity of dopamine or neurotransmitters in general. They can receive a reward for, let's say, a certain task that for someone with ADHD, it will be a depressed reward. They're not going to get that. So to compensate, the person with ADHD, or how we define it, has to compensate by hyper focusing on interest to try to get the reward back to the baseline or what is can sustain you could sustain anyone your life. So yeah, the thing the problem with these disorders a lot of times is and there's a lot of misconceptions. They're not. I can't define it correctly either. I mean, there's so much range and so many different variables. Like one case would be different than another case, different than another case. So ultimately, you get all these like you're juggling all these different cases, and it's going to be different. You got to look at the different cases, of course, and ultimately not just judge it based on just symptoms alone. I mean, of course, this symptom could be a cause of this or that or that. Different. The technology can make you distractive. Make more distractive, and therefore create symptoms that align with what you'd find with ADHD. But in actuality, what's happening is it's shifting the reward signaling in such a case that you need this to happen at a higher frequency to yield the similar output. So for instance, let's suppose in social media we get reward. Let's say you send a Snapchat or you send your idea to someone or you send a selfie or you send anything and you get followers or you get likes. Well, let's suppose now you keep the likes it's a certain level, and you want it to increase. You want it to be monotonic increasing. Ideally, you want it to like project and keep going on, depending on your expectation. And ultimately, if it happens to go the other way, let's suppose you initially get a lot of feedback, you get a lot of followers, you get a lot of likes, and now it just disappears and it tends, so like everything's good, and then all of a sudden, let's say it shifts the opposite direction. So it goes like a normal distribution function. It goes up and then reaches the top, the max, and then it starts going down another direction. Well, of course, in this case, you got to compensate in some way, in order to get back to where because that feedback that you got, it's now a new level. It's a new new equilibrium or new or not necessarily equilibrium, but it's a new level that you basically respond to, and you get this natural or normal response. And ultimately, if you get anything less than that, it actually has more of a magnitude of change. So like if you have a distinction of what used to be and now you're at this level, well, if the distinction's larger, you cause more negative reaction if you're going in a negative direction. So so basically this is a problem with especially with a lot of these disorders is they're very very subjective a lot of times. I know there's objectivity, but a lot of times you're everyone's going to define it differently. You have different cases and a different range of uh, uh, what is needed to get in designate. And of course there's going to be some corruption like the insurance, like you got to make money, and ultimately you're going to add like all these new diagnoses, and they're not going to be very there's not going to be as much precision initially, and ultimately, it's going to be. It gets easier when you get a more in-depth understanding. So of course, if you broaden, like if you have a doctor who goes in depth or deep, and broadens the range of understanding, it's a little bit easier to categorize or define what do you fit within this area. But at the same time, a lot of these disorders, again, is to normalize things. It's like for instance, bipolar disorder, or with depression or bipolar is, it's like there's a lot of misconceptions there too. Yes, like I like to think of it as like it's your body tries to reach an equilibrium, or it tries to reach a balance, um, and what ends up happening is you shift energy due to stress, or like even drinking alcohol or doing drugs. You're shifting your energy so much that, for instance, a cycle naturally, if you don't do any of these things, is usually going to be smooth. You try to get back, like if you go up, your body, you try to get back to this midpoint. You go down, you try to get back, but it's not, the magnitude's not much of a change. But as you cause all these shifts in energy, you're causing shifts in other areas of your body, and ultimately it's causing shifting the balance, and the balance is kind of becoming offset, and as the offset becomes larger, you're creating more. Of course, these shifts prevents the communication between the neurotransmitters. When you cause more inflammation, you cause more disruption. You're disrupting the balance that is natural. It's like a force. Think of the balance as a force. And when we try to reach equilibrium, it's like gravity. You try to, you're pulling gravity towards the central region. A central region, let's say the plane of Earth. And what's end up happening is gravity becomes weaker and weaker and weaker as you disrupt the communication between the neurotransmitters, and through like toxicity, or through inflammation, or negative mindset, or any of these negative reactions are going to basically be triggering zones, and ultimately cause physiological stress. And as you increase the physiology, okay, then you reduce this gravitational pull, or it's not necessarily gravity, but it's a force, and therefore the waves, the spikes become larger and larger and larger, until you naturally realign yourself to a state of trying to reach a balance, especially when you get in the throes of like mania and stuff like that. Initially, medication is probably the best intervention to take, just to get yourself into that, prevent the kind of get yourself back to the balance, or the initial point. But there are so many things that you can do to try to achieve balance. Like abiding by the sleep schedule, not going to, because essentially I think of like bipolar as like a state of chaos. You can create chaos, like if you disrupt your sleep and you sleep at random times. Let's say I sleep at midnight, then I sleep 6 in the morning, then I sleep 4 in the morning. I'm causing all these shifts, and I'm disrupting the cycle and the harmony of everything. So essentially, this creates the disharmony or disequilibrium. It's tending you away from equilibrium, and ultimately, it's causing this spread in the states, mood, or the states of the pulse. So to prevent, to minimize it, the key is you try to find routine, try to find balance. You gotta get your mindset, try to situate it, prevent the resistance, prevent these triggers, try to minimize it. And it may not get perfect. It's not may not get back to perfect balance, but you're tending in that direction. But the problem is with bipolar is it overlaps with a lot of other disorders like ADHD. Could sometimes be misinterpreted as mania. Borderline personality disorder, very similar. There's a lot of overlap within these zones, and histrionic, or all these personality disorders. I mean, there's so many disorders in overlapping regions that's very hard to like get to the exact, unless you spend a lot of time to deconstruct everything and try to get to the bottom. Pull everything together, and ultimately it takes a lot of variables, and it's not going to be happen like very immediately. Of course, if you have a lot of experience, the convergence is at a faster time, because you may find patterns and this and that can lead you and converge you to the possible solution. But ultimately, it's not going to be set in stone all the time. A lot of these disorders, like I mentioned, is to for normalization. It's we have to kind of do it to restrict uh, the extremes, but at the same time, there's a lot of misconceptions. Like even with bipolar, like some people, some have like these spiritual awakening or experiences. They could be seem, similar. They'd be like, okay, this is a mania, this is psychosis, this is delusional, this is that, and whoa, there's a fine line. I think like if your perception expands, if the world becomes more vivid or alive, and you're pulling in more input, and things kind of become convoluted at first, so let's say it's expanding and your ideas are flying all over the place, well, of course it's just like it could be, things are processing speed like increases. Well, in this generation it may be defined so, but in other generations it may not be defined because the processing speed increases and so forth. And you're basically the boundaries are going to be now, the upper boundary is now going to be in the normality region. So we're not going to define it like that. So I think it always evolves. It's always changing, and I think now you just have to be don't be carried away and don't like just take it as set in stone. So I think with a lot of these disorders is it's good to know the differences, and not necessarily categorize yourself as this or that, and uh, and basically not take it as I mean, there's a lot of negativity in terms of biases regarding these disorders, like even autism. A lot of people think associate autism with negativity, but it's not actually like that. It's a different way of perceiving the world. And autism, like I believe, in terms of like social problems, just consider, you know, okay, think of it this way: social problems is a big issue with it's a diagnostic criteria. It's one of the big critical diagnostic criteria. And what ends up happening is imagine yourself in a situation and where like you communicate early on in your life, and you pick up on the cues, the social cues, and basically it gets to the point where it becomes like an instinct. It becomes instantaneous, or it becomes like an intuition. It becomes something that you don't have to invest a lot of energy in. It just becomes natural. You're not have to process more information than is needed, and it comes to you very easily. Therefore, everything is condensed, and you can process, and you limit the zone or the range, and therefore it doesn't create this upper or chaos, this bound like region where you become hypersensitive or you go into shutdown mode. So with autism, a lot of times you reach the shutdown zone because instead of naturally having the instinctual understanding, or it's like the processing is instantaneous in regards to like all these cues, what ends up happening, in my view, is it's extra processing. It's not something that is natural. So you have to process more information than is needed. So therefore, it reaches that collapse area where you actually shut down. Everyone has a limit. It's through adaptation, but ultimately, if you're adding all these different variables, it can cause problems, and therefore it causes people with autism to shift to different areas outside of the communication zone because that's an uncomfortable area. So they may go gravitate to different areas like mathematics or areas that don't have the social you know, disruption. So essentially, there's a lot of like stigma going out there, and the key is if you have a more depth understanding, you understand, just a range of, just the positives as well, and ultimately, every different disorder has some gifts, and some, as long as it doesn't go too extreme. And I think it's always good when you go to if you get to the extreme cases, you have to try to mitigate it somehow, whether it's medical intervention and other overlapping therapies. So yeah, that's just what I have today. I think there's a lot of like I said, there's a lot of issues and misconceptions regarding all these disorders. I didn't cover, there's many more disorders to cover, but yeah, I'm going to stop here, and I'll see you next time.